All right, let's welcome back from lunch those outside and those online. We're setting up for...
Recording in progress.
Thank you very much. We're setting up for our third session, which is the impact of the Canal Plus purchase of MultiChoice. And on the panel, we have Stephen Budlender from MultiChoice. Thank you. We have Tilis Ferreira, who's online. And our moderator is William Bird, who is the Director of Media Monitoring Africa. And please join us on the stage. And then Tshepiso Chikapapiri unfortunately could not make it today. Uyanda, who's replacing Tshepiso? Me. Oh, I'll be sitting in for Tshepiso, it seems. All right, so let me prepare myself.
Hello, so it's working. Yes, good. Right, welcome to the after lunch session on a Friday. Do we need another one? No, but there's this chair here. He can sit in the middle. So, not only do we have two white men on this panel, we also have a full panel. For which we apologize profusely, but I hope we can make up for that. We'll make some, well, I'll probably make some bad taste French jokes, to which Stephen will no doubt reply appropriately. But it should be a fun session. At least we're going to try and make it a fun session. It's been a really cool morning, and we're sort of shifting gear to look a little bit beyond the SABC. But we are going to be looking, I did have a slightly more nuanced sort of title for it. I was going to call it News and Neo-Colonialism. Sorry, I had to get the digs in. Okay, so we are talking about the Canal Plus takeover of MultiChoice. So for those of us in the room, MultiChoice has historically been our gorilla in our broadcast sector, the de facto monopoly. Some will dispute that in the room, but that's okay. And they've also been one of the organizations that has been at the forefront of innovation. They've supported local content at times when few others would, and when the SABC's finances went to hell in a handbasket, I think had it not been for MultiChoice, our local content sector would have been a complete and utter disaster. So, like many things in South Africa, it's a kind of a nuanced sort of picture, or at least something that's got both positive and extremely negative kinds of sides and consequences. Now, you'll remember that some few years ago, MultiChoice was then up for, I don't think you were open to it initially. I think they tried a hostile version of the takeover initially, and the MultiChoice people refused that first iteration. And I think the second iteration, because they offered a lot more money, the MultiChoice shareholders said, this looks enticing. But there were a number of hurdles to overcome, and we aren't going to talk about those particular hurdles, but what we are going to talk about, given the nature of the room and the focus of the room, are a few particular key themes that link to our speakers, and I'll get round to asking them to introduce themselves in just a moment. But the kinds of things we're going to be looking at are what this deal means for news content, what it means for sport, and what it means for local content. So on the panel, we've got different people to speak to these issues, and we are very lucky to have Stephen Budlender, who some of us knew in his previous iteration in life as one of our nation's finest advocates, and is now doing the work for Canal Plus in their new form and iteration. And if you ask him nicely, he'll speak in a very, very, very good French accent, because this is what they're learning now. When you go to, I was at MultiChoice headquarters yesterday, and there are all these French flags, and you get fed croissants, and
Can I just be clear
and
and say,
everyone wears a beret.
William is, I used to be William's lawyer, and I'm still William's friend, and I say this with all the love and respect I have for William. You can't trust a word he says when he's taking out multi-choice. But William, it's lovely to be here, and lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for having me.
Can you introduce yourself a bit more then, seeing
Yes,
as you
sure.
decided to just speak
Well,
over the
at some
moderator?
point I had to intervene. William, I believe in avoiding the misinformation, as I know you do. So, no, good afternoon. I'm Stephen Budlander. I spent 19 years at the bar, acting as an advocate, doing a lot of work for MMA and SOS and e-media and data multi-choice, and really enjoyed my practice there. And then decided I needed something different and went to multi-choice, only to be confronted with the Canal Plus offer. And William's right when he says that initially multi-choice was not keen, but for various reasons, which I'm happy to go into if it's helpful, the multi-choice board took a different view and decided it was in the long-term strategic interests of the company. And I'm happy to talk about that. But I'm delighted to be here, and thank you so much for having me, and really appreciate the opportunity.
Cool. I'm going to come back to you for context. Now, those of us who've been in the room the whole day will know that Simon has been moderating, and he at the last minute very kindly stepped in for his colleague Tapiso. Do you want to just introduce the role in which you're here now and your background? Because you didn't do that when you introduced yourself this morning, Simon.
Thank you, Willem. I feel like Malcolm in the middle right now. Yeah, so Simon Magwela, I've been a film and media practitioner for the last 23 years or so. I currently sit as the public representative of the South African Guild of Editors, and I also sit on the council of SASFED, and I'm the chairperson of the South African Audiovisual Cluster as well. So really like high energies here between the two gentlemen. But I'm blessed to be part of the panel, and I'm also blessed to be the program director here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And then online we've got Tinas, who we tend to speak on the phone often, and usually it's in relation to a crisis, very often about SABC. Tinas, do you want to just introduce yourself, please?
Hello there, I hope I'm audible. Yes, I'm a independent print journalist, and I've been covering the TV and film industry for about 25 years now. I started out as a hard news journalist. Yeah, and often the broadcasters or the industry might think I'm a little bit too harsh, and it's because I sort of transitioned from covering hard news and crime and court to the film and TV sphere, and where they're not maybe sometimes so used to being, if you look at like real coverage, it's usually mostly politics or car accidents or the economy, and then sort of the rest, and sport, and the rest is all of those lifestyle things where the expectation is often like, yeah, we just want them to republish the press release, and when you don't do that, people get upset. So yeah, but yeah, been interesting to sort of cover this industry for the past few years, and yeah, quite interesting developments every year.
Cool. I'm going to ask you to do a bit of a fact check then, maybe when I ask Stephen to answer the next question, and you can give us your take. So, Stephen, can you tell us why you think this deal is a good thing or a bad thing for the kinds of sectors that we look at, specifically in relation to public interest content? I noticed in the SENS announcement, the SENS announcement is the thing they send out to Joburg Stock Exchange, that one of the first lines of that was that they said that this deal made significant, I think was the word, commitments to public interest protections or public interest commitments, made significant, forget the line now, but can you tell us why you think this is or isn't the case? You can speak freely, you're among friends.
Sure. So, William, I mean, I think maybe if I can just start by dealing with the point that you raised. I mean, when the Canal Plus bought shares in MultiChoice on the open market, and the shares grew, and ultimately Canal Plus put forward an offer for MultiChoice, and it was rejected by the MultiChoice board. One of the reasons was the price. But the other reason was, at that point, I think it's fair to say that the MultiChoice board wasn't persuaded that it was in everyone's strategic interests. But I think that, and it's, I'm only disclosing public information here, MultiChoice has been under huge pressure financially. I think we know that MultiChoice went into a negative equity position about 18 months ago. We know that MultiChoice has been shedding subscribers at an unprecedented rate, not just in South Africa, but across the African continent. And so I think, as much as William likes to describe us as the gorilla in the room or the monopolist, which is of course quite wrong, but the point is, MultiChoice has been under unprecedented pressure. And I think that the MultiChoice board took the view that a collaboration with Canal Plus was in the long-term interests of MultiChoice. And as I'll explain in a moment, that is, in our view, in the interests of all of the sectors you speak about. I'm happy to unpack why we think it's in the interests of MultiChoice, just for a moment, because I think it might produce an important piece of context. And I think really what you've got to try and understand is that MultiChoice, although it feels like a gorilla perhaps in our environment, or used to, I'm not sure it does anymore, we have 16 million subscribers across the African continent. That sounds like a lot. Netflix, as I'm sure you all know, has 302 million subscribers across the world. So when you talk about who we're playing against, it's not just the SABC or eMedia. It's Netflix with its 302 million subscribers. It's Disney. It's Amazon. It's hundreds of millions of subscribers. And of course, we're playing against them because we know what happens to the content that they have is they use their content across the world. So I don't want to ask how many of you have watched Squid Games, but Squid Games is the South Korean program produced by Netflix and now broadcast across the world. The same with The Crown, the same with Lupin, which is in French, William. Lupin. So Netflix uses its content across the world, and that's wonderful for viewers, and we should all say that. But what that means is that when Netflix makes content, it can amortize its costs across 300 million subscribers. We can only amortize our costs across 16 million. When Netflix engages in tech to combat piracy, its development of tech can be amortized across 300 million subscribers. We can only do it across 16 million. And that is a huge challenge, and I think we need to be realistic about that, and that is one of the pressures MultiChoice has been under such pressure. And we felt that the only way to make MultiChoice truly sustainable into the future was to increase its scale. And the only way to increase its scale was the combination with Canal Plus, who has 24 million subscribers across many in Africa, many in Europe, some in Asia. And it produces an entity which, and I think our CEO has made it quite clear, produces an entity which is the only entity which really has a chance of challenging the top 5 US broadcasters. They're all US broadcasters, apart from the Canal Plus group, which now includes us. And we think it's important from that point of view. So that's why the MultiChoice board felt that this was in the long-term interests of MultiChoice, and indeed Canal Plus, who had the same problem of scale. Now, why does all of that matter to the question William asked? It matters because MultiChoice, and I think William and others in the room would agree, MultiChoice has been a huge supporter of local industry in terms of sports industry, in terms of local productions, in terms of all the things that we've done, CSI initiatives. But that's only sustainable if MultiChoice is sustainable. If MultiChoice is shedding subscribers and having to cut costs, none of that is sustainable. So that's the first reason why I think this transaction is good for all of those sectors, because without a sustainable MultiChoice, those sectors are not going to be supported in the same way by MultiChoice. But the second reason is that, as you will know, when you go through the competition process, you have to make a series of public interest commitments. Those commitments, there is a public version of those on the Competition Tribunal website. There are the figures redacted, and I'll only refer to the public interest commitments that are public. But for example, one of the commitments that is made there is the renewal of the SABC News channel, that's a public commitment, and we've had to agree to renew it. We think that's a very good thing. We've had to agree to continue a series of South African news channels. The number is not specified in the period, but I can tell you, in public, but I can tell you it sustains South African news into the future on MultiChoice. We've had to commit to sustain our level of local content investment, our level of HDP investment. A series of things that we do have had to be agreed to be sustained over a period of 3 years, whereas previously, and absent this deal, all of that would have declined. So those commitments, in our view, are fundamental in order to protect the industries that you speak of. And that's why we think that it is a deal that is good for MultiChoice, of course, MultiChoice shareholders, of course, but more importantly, the South African viewing public and the sectors you speak about.
Okay, so there's the sunshine, roses and lollipops version of the deal. And as I said, I think, you know, these these things are complex because had it not been for MultiChoice, we wouldn't have SABC 404, Newsroom Africa, or ENCA, and then many of the community TV channels also wouldn't be being broadcast across them and subsidized, I think, to a large degree. I don't know to what extent. And the impact of that on our news diversity would be incredible if it had not been for them committing to carrying those things on. So even though, I mean, I think I keep making fun of this, but my reservation about the deal is because we now have, once again, the entire continent is covered by a French-owned entity. So African content, African broadcasting is essentially controlled by a French entity. And that, I think, may have potential implications, and I don't know to what extent we can deal with those, but I think there are things that we want to think about, especially when you look at the track record of the owner of Canal Plus. And we'll get to whether or not they've given any commitments to editorial protections, etc. The owner of Canal Plus is someone a lot like Donald Trump, only with an outrageous French accent and a lot less charm, if you can imagine such a creature. Anyway, that said, we'll come back to you and you can answer some of those things. Tinus, do you want to just respond to the issues that Stephen has raised, if there's particular concern, if you think that you agree with him on the positive side of these elements, and then Simon, I'm going to come to you specifically on local content. Tinus?
I mean, I don't know how happy the French would have been if they suddenly discovered that a South African company wants to buy and own the holding company of the Eiffel Tower or the holding company of the Empire State Building in New York. I'm sure there would be an outcry. But because we're in a developmental country and we have always bigger or issues that seem more immediate, like a lack of water or potholes or whatever it is, to sort of think big scheme about a media issue of one country's company buys a company in another country. It doesn't seem urgent, and it doesn't seem like a big deal until the day when you suddenly run into an issue. So I wouldn't say there's really maybe an urgent problem or an issue with Canal Plus, but when I go to the shop and I stand in front of aisle 5 and it's the illusion of choice and you think, am I going to buy Sunlight or Omo or Skip, and you don't realize that they all belong to Unilever in the whole aisle. So whoever you buy, your money still goes to the same company. And I think it sort of speaks to the issue of media plurality. Like, what if we end up with whatever shade of color you maybe buy, it all belongs to the very same company? And we've seen, or when I read about especially American companies taking over each other, there's always like the promises at the beginning. I recently read about what happened when T-Mobile brought Sprint and they made all of these promises, and you can go and look where Sprint is today. It's dead, it's gone. It just sort of gets enveloped into the bigger company. So I think it's very important to kind of figure out, and both of you mentioned, Canal Plus is kind of saving MultiChoice, but MultiChoice is again saving sort of the news channels. So yes, all good and well, but it all keeps being aggregated into like a bigger pool, and eventually everything sits in the same basket. And I think that's sort of maybe the danger. If everything belongs to the same place, where's the different voices?
Okay, I will let you respond in a moment.
Good.
And you can comment on the... I mean, I hadn't thought of that perspective about it being a uniquely South African kind of identifying gorilla. even though it was at least our local guerrilla. But, I think that there's something to be said about that and identity and what it's done, especially in the realm of local content. Simon, do you want to chime in here and your take on what this deal means for local content? Do you think the sector's happy? Are they going to benefit from it? The potential exposure to Canal Plus, or are you expecting that whatever deals that were being done are going to be that much harder?
So there's a lot to unpack, and besides, there's one side where you'd say, you play the devil's advocate, where you say you agree that yes, and I'm going to challenge you and say that first and foremost, there is a monopoly. And the monopoly does exist only because of the fact that Starsat no longer competes in that same market. You can't compete with the top TV because that's free to air. But it's not a monopoly that's created out of, a desire to be a monopolist, but it is a monopoly in the sense that you control 100% of the pay TV market in South Africa. The second one is that you control, if you talk about the HIHI index, where you look at the critical concentration of local content spend, they've been good. And the reason why MultiChoice has been good on that is because 7.7 billion rand has been spent on local content between the 2024 financial year, which is the 77% of the spend of local content in the country. And that's good because it's covered a deficit from the SABC, where the SABC has been incapacitated and unable to spend that much money. SABC, I think, spent 1.4 billion, which is way below their mandate, where they should be spending around 5 billion in that financial year term. So that's been a positive good. And you can always look at television from a perspective of, yes, news will drive a certain level of viewership, but local programming is also very, very important. And local programming also sits on the lines of cultural identity, sits on preservation of heritage, all of those that are necessary to build patriotism and build a South African identity as well. Now, we've questioned many, many times, what does a South African identity look like when it comes to local programming? You look at Nollywood. Nollywood has its own identity through its films. Bollywood has its own identity through films. Hollywood has its own identity through films. Patriotism and propaganda and all of that exist in the storylines as well. And South Africa has struggled to sort of go beyond what they call Bantustan storytelling, which was the agenda back then, pre-94, when that was all owned by state media. Yep. 86, Mnet comes through, changes a bit of the narrative to speak to a different type of audience. It's no longer public broadcasting. We had a good trajectory to move to from that point, which hasn't been taken full advantage of. But in this transition now, 30 years after democracy, we're now sitting in a position where our largest spender for local content sits within the hands of a foreign entity. And I think that is where it's very, very dangerous to sit. So yes, of course we can argue that there's been moratoriums and there's been commitments that have been made and everything. But what is the guarantee that we have, first and foremost, that let's talk about it from a commissioning perspective. Recently we had DCDT's commissioning and broadcast regulations. We had comments on that through SASPED as well. And on those, you have to stipulate some of the criteria to which we hold commissioning editors to. And commissioning editors, being the main key storyteller and the custodians of the contract from the broadcaster, will mold the storyline towards what they feel is viable and useful for their audience aggregation, build their audiences, everything. If we don't control those narratives, then who really does? Is it the voice in the back that says, no, we wanted to speak to this agenda specifically? Or are we going to allow it to be autonomous and speak to the agenda of nation building because South Africans essentially are still in control of that? Now, I do know that the content sits in a different entity that is going to be held South Africa. I don't know if you can maybe tell me if that's true. All right. So if that is the case, then how long does that content, does new content also go into there? I don't think, I might have missed those details, but I don't know if that new content goes there, or does new content get exploitable on the other side of the pond? And the second thing would be, and this may be a question as well, because I don't think I have this platform again, but the second question is to say that if then Okay, actually, let me pause with that one question because I haven't articulated this question properly in my head. But the question that I wanted to ask is that, are we still in control and are we still owners of our own content? Oh, that's the question. Would producers still benefit should these products be exploited on international soils? Is it a matter that we'll get royalties back to pay our producers? Will our actors also benefit from those royalty deals, etc.? So maybe it's a matter, like Tinus has said, that if you don't continuously remind audiences and continuously remind readers of what it is that the organization is doing for the better good, then how are we supposed to support it if we don't know that it exists as well? So I mean, just leave it there.
Okay, Rocky, we're going to give you an opportunity to respond to some of these things. And I guess the things to think about are in relation to a little bit to identity and those ideas about. So I mean, South Korea might say, well, thanks to Netflix, several big series have now been commissioned and their local content sector's booming, etc., etc. And there's an argument to be made that this may have a similar impact on much of the content of our programs. But I guess there's a question there about it's going to be a specific kind of program and a specific kind of content that they're going to produce. And how do we ensure and protect diversity and critically maintain hold of that? Because again, it's good that we've got a commitment for news for the next something X years, right? But it was done less as a commercial venture and more out of largely necessity for the sector and because of their identity within South Africa's space that those channels were supported. So with a person who doesn't have a friendly relationship to identity and certainly to progressive ideas around pluralism and diversity, I guess the questions are then if you can frame your responses in relation to those things.
So maybe I can just start by, with respect, just politely disagreeing with the question of a monopoly and just explain why. You know, I'd just like to ask whether there's anyone in the room who has at any point considered turning off their DSTV and going for Netflix instead. Anybody? Well, there you have the fact that there is a competitive market. Because the idea that, I mean, I like that Thandi agreed. I mean, she may never be spoken to by William again, but no, but quite seriously, there may well have been an era where pay TV was in its own market, linear television, but it's not anymore. And it's not anymore because of exactly the hands that you've just seen. People switch between Netflix and DSTV. Some people have both. Some people have neither. And so the idea that we're a monopoly, if it was ever true, it's certainly not true today. And you can see that in our subscriber numbers, and you can see that in the number of people who've gone to Netflix. And I see it in my own household. Don't tell my bosses, but there's a great deal more Netflix that's watched in my household at the moment than DSTV, except by me.
We will get to sport, though, huh?
Oh, no, we'll get to sport. So I think the monopoly point, but let's leave the monopoly point aside and come to the identity point that Tinus raised. And let me start by saying, look, it's quite an irony here, because for years everyone, including William, was unhappy with MultiChoice as the big gorilla in the room and the negative things that a MultiChoice had. Now suddenly MultiChoice is being bought by somebody else, and now in fact it was wonderful to have MultiChoice as the leader. So I will comment on that irony. But the more important point is I totally get Tinus's point. The example of if you go to the shop and you're buying Omo and Stay Soft and the next one, and they're all made by the same person and you don't know. I get it. But that's not where we are. We've gone from an entity which used to be owned by one person, Naspers, to an entity after a couple of years on the JSE, which is now owned by another single person, which is Canal+. So you can still go and buy HTV, you can still watch SABC, you can still buy Netflix, I see Disney's now expanded their sports offering, William. Just yesterday, Disney expanded their sports offering. So in fact, you've got more choice now on the TV market than you ever had before. And the idea that you've lost choice and that it's now all controlled by the French is just obviously wrong. That's the first point. But the second point is that I think it's important, and I think it was touched on earlier, to just understand the structure. The way the structure works is not that the whole of MultiChoice was bought by Canal+ and is now controlled by Canal+. Because in fact what had to happen to make sure that we complied with the Electronic Communications Act is we had to carve out part of MultiChoice, MultiChoice Pty Limited or License Co, which holds the broadcasting license. The way that this was rendered compliant with the law was we took the entity with whom you all contract when you hopefully subscribe for DSTV, License Co, MultiChoice Pty Limited, that is the party you take out your contract with. That is the party that holds the broadcasting license. And that entity is not controlled by Canal+. It has been carved out, and it has 5 different shareholders. It has MCG, MultiChoice Group, which holds 20% of the votes. It has Putumanati, MCG's long-standing BEE partner, who, by the way, when we're talking about how South Africans react, Putumanati voted in favor of this transaction, 99% in favor. Those are ordinary men and women, ordinary black shareholders voting 99% in favor of this transaction. They're the second shareholder and the largest vote. They've got, I think, 39% of the vote. You have Sipho Maseko and his consortium. Sipho Maseko used to head up Telkom. He's got approximately, off the top of my head, about 11% of the vote. You've got Sonia de Bruin, another South African, with a strong consortium with another 11% of the vote. And you've got a workers' trust made up of ordinary people who work on the one side or the other side who had up for another 9 or 10% of the vote. So when we're talking about the broadcaster is not controlled by Canal+ at all. It is deliberately not controlled by Canal+ because there would have been a problem under the law. You have 5 shareholders, they have to work together, and 4 of those shareholders and 80% of the vote are South Africans, overwhelmingly black South Africans. So when you talk about diversity and plurality, for the first time we have the MultiChoice broadcasting license controlled by black South Africans. That's the first point. But the second point in relation to that is that that broadcaster will determine where it gets its content from. At the moment, it is getting it from SuperSport and Mnet, which makes perfect sense because of the long-standing relationship. But that broadcaster will have to determine where it gets its content in the future. So, in fact, rather than say we've got now a monolithic one broadcaster controls everything, you've got more broadcasting choice than you've ever had, and even within the MultiChoice, what used to be the MultiChoice stable, you've got that. So, I think it's wrong to say that. And for the same reason, William, your concern about the news is just misplaced. And I say that with great respect. Because what we've committed to ICASA is that the news will never be procured by the MultiChoice Group. The news is always, South African news, is always going to be procured by License Co. And License Co, remember, owned by South Africans, mainly black South Africans, with Canal+ MultiChoice Group only having a 20% vote. So, yes, of course, there is a concern about South African news. That's why we made the undertaking. But that concern, I mean, if what you say is news going to be commercially sustainable in the future? I don't know. No. But without this deal, it might not have been commercially sustainable. What this deal does is 2 things. It gives you the guarantee to the Competition Commission of a large number of years that the news channels are sustainable. And secondly, beyond that, the only people who can procure news are License Co, not Canal+. South African news, not Canal+, and not the MultiChoice Group. So that leads me to the third point. And the third point is the important point about local content. And I think it's fair, and I appreciate the acknowledgement that MultiChoice has been the biggest supporter of local content in this country. And we regard that as a huge contribution that we've made, and we will continue to do so for 2 reasons, maybe 3 reasons. The first is that it's in keeping with what Canal+ does. Canal+ is a huge believer in local content across the continent in its Francophone region. Why does it do that? Not because it's a nice person, but because it thinks that that is what is commercially sustainable. That is its comparative advantage. That's the first point. The second reason is that we have made these commitments to the Competition Commission, and we've done so rightly. And the third reason is that, of course, there are various local content regulations which have to be complied with, and those remain binding. So from the point of view of commercial reality, from the point of view of the commitments made, and from the point of view of the regulations, local content is not going anywhere. There is going to be huge expenditure on local content, just as there's been in the past, and we think, as I say, that if the deal hadn't happened, there would have been far more threat to that. So we value local content, and Maxime Sada, our CEO, has said, he believes in Africans telling their own stories. That is his view across the continent. And he is the CEO of Canal+, and he's said it publicly. So I think the anxiety about local content is understandable, but I don't think it's justified as a consequence of this merger.
And to Simon's concerns about what it means for local producers, are you able to help us?
You mean about the stuff being exploited overseas?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry, apologies for not getting there. So, Simon, I think it's a fair question, but I think the answer is that when the producers go and negotiate with MultiChoice, they should say, what am I getting paid if this is exploited in South Africa, and what am I getting paid if it gets exploited overseas? And it's a question of pure contract, because of course you sell the rights, and it has to be, and then the rights can be exploited. But I think it's a fair debate to have. But certainly, as you'll know, I do think it creates greater opportunities for the exploitation of South African content overseas. But I would have thought that's good for the South African local content industry, because if I'm a great South African actor, and suddenly I'm being seen in France and Europe and Thailand and everywhere else, or if I'm a South African director and my name is seen, I would have thought that's a good thing. And when you look at the example of Spinners, which was a Canal Plus MCG combination, and was really a great production, I think, I think the opportunities for collaboration are good.
Okay, Tinus, I'm going to give you a quick opportunity to respond to what Stephen said, then I'm going to hit the issue of sport, and then we'll open it to the floor for questions. Tinus?
So obviously License Co had to be carved out because it would have violated the regulations. But who pays License Co? Canal Plus. So as a freelance journalist, I also write for numerous publications, and I can say I'm a freelance journalist. But when that publication briefs me in terms of what they want from me, in terms of a 1,000-word article for that price, they tell me, we want this article, we want that to be in there, we want you to interview this or that. So yes, License Co is controlled by shareholders, but they get who's their client? Canal Plus is the client. So that's what I mean by it's being controlled by a French company. License Co doesn't have. It's obviously going to do it's going to supply the content and package the content that Canal Plus wants from it. Yes, Maxime Sada said. They believe in African content. Amazon Prime Video also said exactly the same thing to me until they suddenly decided they no longer wanted to be in Africa. They're shutting everything down, and they left producers and viewers and everybody in the lurch. So I would say I'm open-minded, but I'm skeptical.
William, can I just correct something there? Because Tennis, with respect, you've got it exactly wrong. The party who is the broadcaster is License Co, and License Co is not the License Co is the client, because License Co obtains its content from MultiChoice Group. So the way it works is that License Co has its own board, its own CEO. License Co is the broadcaster, and License Co says to SuperSport, we want you to package this kind of sport. And it says to Mnet, we want you to package this general entertainment. And then the content is sent across. So it's exactly the opposite way around. The party who is in control of the relationship is License Co. It is the party who is demanding specifications. So in your example, you are MultiChoice being told what you have to give, and your newspapers who are telling you what to give is License Co. So it's exactly the opposite way around. License Co is not under the thumb of MultiChoice. It's exactly the opposite.
Okay.
Well, yeah, can I just answer? So if Canal Plus thinks...
Yep,
so if Canal Plus thinks it wants more sport from a certain genre, will it say we want that content, or is it up then to MultiChoice to tell Canal Plus we want to add another bicycle TV channel?
It's for License Co, which is the independent entity, to say to MultiChoice / Canal Plus, which is now one group, we want more sport that is high premium sport, or we want more sport that is paddle, or we want more whatever. So to use a technical term, the specifications for the content are set by License Co. And then it's the job of their content providers, in this case, MultiChoice / Canal Plus, to provide the content that meets the specifications.
Okay.
Before we go, sorry,
Okay, go
it's really tough being between an attorney, a journalist, and a lobbyist, honestly. But I want to just say one thing, and I think it comes back down to, I think the MultiChoice problem that we're discussing, not problem, let's call it the challenge, that we're discussing right now is not really something that exists in isolation of all the other factors that we have economically in our sector right now. I think the big thing that we're challenged with is, like we don't have as many distributors as we would. To support an industry the size of what our industry really is. Money is being shifted out of the market as well. Advertisers are now going overseas. So the big thing here that we're sitting with is what we'd say is media colonialism, digital colonialism, that has happened across the scale. Facebooks, your YouTubes, your, well, Amazon's now out, but the idea that money that's being spent by South Africans for these local contents, and I can almost bridge where tennis is coming from, is that that money is not going to South Africans, it's going somewhere else. And it's not just happening on our satellite television platform, and Showmax is actually one of the winners in the market right now, to be honest with you, with, I mean, how many is it? Like 500 plus international streamers in the country and only 7 South African streamers. But the idea is to say that African content is winning, and the research shows it very clearly that the African content is actually winning. But where we are spending our money, our South African rands are not going to South African companies. And I think that that's something that needs to be looked into from a regulatory perspective, even though the regulations exist, they're not being adhered to enough and not being supported enough by government in order for them to benefit South African audiences as well. Audience development is also very, very low. Yeah. Attention spans are dwindling, but only because we've just shifted this entire from sitting down in television at 7 o'clock every night to everyone being on their own screen and you know, flipping through algorithms. So I think there's a number of systematic things that need to be addressed in order to reverse where the needle is right now, where content consumption exists and the spend on local content from a colonialized perspective in the corporate and digital spheres. So that money that is spent by South Africans can exist on South African programming and exist in South African television, on South African screens, sorry.
Right, in the interest of allowing questions from the floor, I'm going to give Stephen a minute to answer this particular thing around in relation to sport. Now, there was some excitement about the deal in terms of particular relevant clauses in relation to sport, but this is an area where, again, MultiChoice has had the monopoly, or rather SuperSport has had the monopoly. They had the, you know, they had the channel, they have the team, they have the referees, they have the football school. I mean, own the theme tune, write the theme tune, sing the theme tune. Not a terrible reference to this group, clearly. Anyway, can you tell us what's significant about this deal in relation to sport?
Look, William, I could give you a long story about how MultiChoice's investment in sport has been key to the success of South African sports, and how MultiChoice puts more money into South African sport than anybody else. When you see the sponsors who sponsor the various Proteas and the Springboks and Bafana, MultiChoice puts more money in to sustain South African sport and develop it than any of them. Okay, so, but I accept that there's an issue, a concern. And let me just read to you from paragraph 11 of the conditions, which says, if the merged entity acquires rights to international sporting events in which South African national teams take part, or individuals represented by selected by South Africa to represent it, it shall make available the rights to South African matches or events to free to national broadcasters on reasonable commercial terms. So what that means in practical terms is that if MultiChoice goes out and buys the free-to-air rights to the Rugby World Cup, then MultiChoice must make those free-to-air rights available to the free-to-air broadcasters on commercially reasonable terms. So, hard to argue with that. What it means, of course, is that the SABC and eMedia have got to come to the party. They've got to pay their share, because there's nothing for free, but it's on reasonable commercial terms. And really, I just can't think of a more positive development than that in relation to sport.
Of course, the devil lies in the definition of who determines commercially reasonable, because for SABC, commercially reasonable is paying 2,000 Rand for license fees, whereas for Canal Plus it may be 200 million.
Yeah, but that'll be a reasonable negotiation. It'll have to be dealt with reasonably. But you can't expect MultiChoice to pay a fortune for sport rights and then hand them out effectively for free to the SABC or eMedia. But the point is, it opens the door for that negotiation to take place, and therefore, if reasonable commercial terms are achieved, it allows those sports to be on free-to-air television.
Right, and that is a critical thing, given the role of the SABC in sports, national identity, social cohesion, etc. Right, we're going to open up for questions. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, none on this side. They're all coming from the left. Okay, right, Dimitri.
Your left.
Oh, please. Yeah, well, no, yeah, if you can just identify yourself when you speak, please.
Thanks. I'm Dimitri Martinez, and thanks for the inputs. Just a question of clarity before I put my questions. I'm clear, and it's to multi-choice, and that is, you said right at the end that multi-choice would be securing rights. Did you mean License Co would be securing rights with rights holders?
No, so the way it works, remember, is that the content providers are License Co chooses. Sorry, let me try again. License Co has appointed multi-choice entities to provide it with certain content. So what that means is they will need to go and secure the rights. So for example, they've appointed SuperSport to go and contract for certain sports rights. And when SuperSport acquires those rights, if they acquire free-to-air rights, they'll have to make them available to free-to-air broadcasters.
So in other words, Mnet is owned by MultiChoice, SuperSport is owned by MultiChoice.
Correct.
Okay. So my question actually is on the news stuff.
Sure.
And I'm glad that Simon went back to 1986, because one of the conditions when Mnet was licensed is that they would not provide news.
Correct.
So the apartheid government was saying, no, SABC has that monopoly.
Yeah.
Moving along, Mnet launched Carte Blanche, but never invested in launching a television news. So we see the same thing with MultiChoice. The trajectory is still there, that MultiChoice is channels, news channels, and putting them on, but not investing in a news operation as such. Do you think that's something that's potentially, talking about diversity, plurality, is it something that might be coming up in the future, or will it always be a case of aggregating news channels from other providers?
So I think it's a great, oh, sorry.
Let's take the questions.
Sure. Sure.
Hi, Stephen. My name is Tandega. My concern and my question is about market conduct. And I'd like to know how all the 12 cases, I think, that MultiChoice has had of abuse of dominance, anti-competitive contracts, exclusionary actions, anti-competitive lobbying, and the Nigerian case of tax avoidance, unfair consumer practices, and the Kenyan cases of predatory pricing, abuse of dominance, unfair contracts, and Tanzanian abuse of dominance, Namibia abuse of dominance, exclusive agreements, unfair pricing in Ghana. Canal Plus has a strikingly similar record all over the continent, taking over companies, buying them, the crown jewel taking strategy, and then shutting down local operators. The Roku TV case, I can mention a few others, but I don't want to bang on. Can we look forward to more malfeasance of this kind?
Okay, so that's a gentle question for a Friday afternoon. Who was my number 3? I think this was just behind.
Afternoon, my name's Kolile. So my question maybe is a bit off track, but what I'm interested in is and the word crown jewel is quite interesting. My interpretation of MultiChoice, one of the other roles it plays, it's actually a cultural ambassador of South Africa, or has been, should I say. In my travels around the continent, I see lots of interesting things, from simple things like hairstyles, which are South African, you see them being copied in other countries because of a channel O or whatever the case may be. What happens going forward in terms of the content that comes out, and will we still have that influence, because that's essentially what MultiChoice was assisting with.
Thank you. There was another question there. Yep, just behind.
Yes, no, mine is very small.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, this is Bongani Kamtembu from Right to Know. So, I just wanted to check with, can you just educate me on this? My son asked me last time that, because he's a chief supporter, Kaizer Chiefs supporter. So he said to me, Papa, why Kaizer Chiefs has selective and smaller games on SABC and SABC2, and the other teams, in fact, other games are on 202, which is DSTV and so on and so on. So I didn't have an exact answer on that. So I think maybe now you can able to educate me. Is it an issue of licensing? Is it an issue of who owns what? Is it an issue of who's bought the rights and so on? What is going on in that situation? Because I think that's the practical problem that we are having in the township in regard to whatever is happening in the SABC. Why these kind of games are not be publicized? The other games are published, like Bafana Fana, but the other games that we normally want to see but are not appearing. Thanks.
Thank you. Was there one last question?
Sure.
Nope, there was 4. Okay, right, gone, good, no more questions. So I'm going to give you a chance to wrap up, and I guess maybe Ola, we'll let you respond to the questions, and then I'll take Tennis and Simon, and then you can have a last 20 seconds.
Thanks. Okay, I'll be brief. I know we're short on time. So, on the question of the news, it's an interesting question. If you ask me for my best guess, no, I do not think that License Co. will be investing in news itself, producing news itself. I think it will continue to get it via channel supply agreements, and I think that's a good thing, because it means that the news is independent of the broadcaster. So for me, the fact that License Co. gets 3 different sources of news and doesn't control any of them, SABC, Newsroom, and ENCA, is a wonderful thing, because it promotes plurality of voices. And I think if License Co. was investing in the news, or MultiChoice had been, by building its own news studios, I think it would be undesirable. So my best guess is they'll stick with what they're doing, and I think that's a good thing from the news diversity and plurality point of view. On the market conduct point, look, a whole bunch of those cases or allegations that have been raised, and I don't know about all of them, but a whole bunch of them are just totally unproven. And some of them were shown not to have any merit. Let me just give you one simple example. The Nigerian tax abuse example that was given. There was a huge announcement by the Nigerian Tax Authority that there'd been abuse in this. That ended up being settled on the basis of a tiny fraction of what the liability was, and that debt's been paid and it's all sorted. Similarly, a number of the complaints against MultiChoice for predatory pricing and those sorts of things have been found not to have merit. I think the reality is that a big company, whether you are MultiChoice or someone else, is going to attract its fair share of complaints. But the reality is that there have never been those sorts of findings against MultiChoice, as far as I'm aware, in any of the jurisdictions that you mentioned. So I think one's got to distinguish quite carefully between allegations that are made and findings that are made of unlawful conduct. On the question of MultiChoice and its ambassador influence, it's an interesting point, and I think we're very proud of the positive effect that MultiChoice has had in that regard. I think you will still see the effects that you talk about, because I think you'll see greater cross-pollination of content. I would hope that there'll be greater South African content now, even in Francophone Africa, perhaps dubbed, perhaps subtitled, and across the area. I don't know, but that would be my guess, is that I don't think it's so much about who owns MultiChoice. It's more about the content, and I think the content will continue for the reasons that I've given. And then lastly, on Bongani's question, yeah, there's a very simple answer. The way the PSL rights work is that they are put out to tender. Anybody can bid for them. MultiChoice won the rights, but was obliged to sub-license a series of games to the SABC. And so what that means in practical terms is MultiChoice has the rights to many games, but some of them it has to sub-license, and does so very willingly, to the SABC. and those games are then screened on the SABC. So what that means, of course, is that not every game is on the SABC, but there are a number of games, and that's just, I think, the commercial reality. It's the same all over the world, whether it's football or any other sport. So, yeah, but one of the things that was made clear by the PSL is that if you buy all the rights, you have to sub-license to free-to-air a number of games, and MultiChoice complies with that at all times.
Okay. Tinus, final wrap-up comment from you, please.
Games that you really want to see, and you said it, the ones that I want to see, I can't, because the company knows that you're going to pay for those. So they give you the cheap ones that are not the big games for free as a marketing exercise. It's sort of like a loss leader, so that they know you're going to pay to watch the final. Wherever the money now goes, or how it goes, the end result is still that SABC News, ENCA, and Newsroom Africa are being paid by the French now. And the last thing that I will just say is, like, the regulations were supposed to prevent foreign media ownership of South Africa, but that's in